Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Reinvention Collaborative Town Hall on supporting staff and faculty mental health and well-being. I'm Liz Bennett, I use she and her pronouns, and I'm Assistant Director of the Reinvention Collaborative. The RC is a consortium of more than 80 research universities dedicated to strengthening undergraduate education. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Nance Roy, Chief Clinical Officer of the Jed Foundation, and Dr. José Villalba, Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Wake Forest University. For today's webinar, Dr. Roy and Dr. Villalba will have a dialogue on how institutions can support and advocate for staff and faculty mental health and well-being. We'll reserve around 15 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So during their conversation, please utilize the Q&A function in Zoom. We will also have the chat enabled and we'll be monitoring that as well. So if you post questions in the chat, we'll still see those. And you can post either to all panelists or to all attendees. Following the Q&A, we'll have representatives from 3 of our member institutions presenting on their campus approaches to supporting staff and faculty well-being. These representatives include Megan Kennedy, Director of the University of Washington's Resilience Lab, Angie Brown, Director of Communications and Work Life for HR at the University of Florida, and Kate Lower, Director of Shift, and Patty Morin-Mix, Assistant Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Director of the First Year Experience Office at the University of Texas at Austin. Today's webinar will be captioned and recorded, and we'll post that captioned recording on the RC website at reinventioncollaborative.org/recordings. Feel free to share this recording with colleagues or anyone you think might be interested. I'll also send out an email to all attendees when that is available. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Roy and Dr. Villalba. Welcome, Nancy and Jose.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having us.
All right. So do you both want to do really quick introductions of yourself? And Nancy, maybe explain what the Jed Foundation is for those who aren't familiar?
Sure, happy to. So I'm Nance Roy. As Liz mentioned, I'm the Chief Clinical Officer for the Jed Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jed, we are a nonprofit whose mission is to promote emotional well-being of teens and young adults, with hopefully the one end being toward reducing suicides and substance misuse. We are 21 years actually right now. Last year was supposed to be our big gala, 20-year gala, but of course that went bust. But I will say that Jed was started 21 years ago by a couple, Donna and Phil Satow, whose son Jed died by suicide when he was in college. And so they started the foundation really initially with quite a narrow focus on suicide prevention, sort of narrowly defined, and then quickly learned over the years that if we want to move the needle on suicide prevention, we really need to be talking about health promotion and promoting well-being and positive mental health. So that is our mission. I've been with Jed for almost 7 years. And I'm a psychologist by training. And prior to that, spent really my whole life on college campuses. Started as a staff psychologist, then I was a director of health and counseling, and then a wellness office, and then an assistant dean, associate dean. So sort of been around the block in college health from both a direct service and an administrative perspective. And we work now with well over 350 colleges across the country, promoting emotional well-being. And the needs of faculty and staff are ever growing. So I'm happy to be here today to share whatever thoughts I have on that.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks for letting Wake Forest be one of those 350 universities that you work with. Appreciate the work that you're doing. My name is José Villalba. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the VP for D&I. As Liz mentioned, I'm also a professor of counseling. So you've got 2 mental health professionals in this town hall to get us all started. I've been an academic almost 20 years, 18 years to be exact. Was a professor of counseling for about 11, 12 years, and then found myself as an administrator over the last few years. Prior to that, I was a school counselor. I've worked in elementary settings and high school settings, and I've also been a private practitioner. So the topic that we're going to discuss today, particularly around faculty and staff and their overall well-being and mental health and support, is something that's near and dear to what I do, not only now, but what I've done for a while. It's nice to be here, and thanks again, Liz, for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and let's dive right in. So the first question, what are the needs and challenges staff and faculty are currently experiencing on our campuses?
So I'll start with that. Many of them are obvious, and probably much of what I say will be, people will nod their heads like, yep, that's happening, that's happening, that's happening. Obviously the first thing that faculty had to adjust to was remote instruction, right? And so that was an enormous challenge. If I were teaching at this point in my career and had to shift to remote learning, I don't know what I would have done. So I think just the mere challenge of learning technology, transitioning all of your materials to remote instruction was quite stressful for many faculty. I would say also for staff, thinking about how, especially student services staff and others, who really work with students on the ground, on campus, in dorms, in clubs, in offices like counseling centers, trying to figure out creative ways to continue to stay connected to students. So just the sort of pragmatics, I think, of getting started during the pandemic. But I also think, there are many other things, and Jose, please chime in, but, we know as we all shifted to working from home, that comes with challenges in and of itself. For anyone who has young children or lives with a large number of people, if your children were doing Zoom instruction and they were 6 years old and can't sit in front of a computer by themselves, juggling being a parent, helping your children, doing your own remote instruction, some having aging parents, other family members that they need that they're caregivers for. So just juggling multiple roles and figuring out, how we can set boundaries. How can we make our lives manageable to get through, in particular, this period? And of course, and Jose, please, I'll stop after this, but also not to forget the impact of what's happening in our world, right? And the social issues that we're seeing. And there's been a lot written on how can we support students through this time, and not a whole lot. I mean, these issues are affecting faculty and staff as well. And I think we need to really hone in on how are we supporting folks through these very difficult times with, systemic racism at an all-time high, with shootings left and right, with it's just, even in my own community yesterday, one town over, another shooting, and we heard about the FedEx shooting this morning. I mean, these are just incredibly challenging times. So I will pause and let you get a word in edgewise, Jose.
Well, I hope it's just a pause, Nancy, because I think there's plenty of space for both of us and everybody else on this call to have this discussion. I think one of the things that struck me when Nancy was responding was this notion of, I'm sure all of you are nodding your heads, or most of you are nodding your heads right now at the things that she's had to say. And yet there's power in that. There's affirmation in knowing that you, as a college administrator, as a faculty member, as a staff member, as a parent, as a loved one, aren't alone in experiencing what so many of us have experienced. There are a couple of dichotomies, of course, between how faculty have experienced the last year and all that it's wrought, and how staff have experienced that as well. So I think for us, it's important maybe to disaggregate. Well, it's always important to disaggregate. You got two social scientists on the call, so we're going to preach disaggregation, right? But I do think it's important to acknowledge that, for example, the caregiver stress that has fallen on faculty and staff falls on staff a little bit differently. And this isn't about false equivalencies or who is suffering more. And the flexibility that I enjoyed, past tense, as a full-time faculty member is gone. And so it's not lost on me the privilege that some faculty have in setting their own calendars or their own schedules. If I need to work on a weekend and write on a weekend and do a little bit more child caring or older adult care providing, I can do that. And yet if you're a staff member, of course, you have less flexibility. And even the jobs that a lot of our staff members do, at Wake, like at most institutions, de-densification is a word that I did not know what it meant before the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, of course, I know all about de-densification. Well, there's some folks that haven't been able to de-densify. The folks who work on our campus and beautify it, the folks that clean our spaces, the folks that prepare meals and who protect our privacy or our safety. And so it's not so much that we must provide those folks with the flexibility that maybe isn't part of their job or their profile, but the simple acknowledging that some folks aren't able to have that flexibility, I think goes a long way. I think in a lot of ways, staff and faculty understand that some things, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, can't be changed. But they often wonder, does anyone see how hard I'm working? Does anyone see that in the background, there are kids or there are adults who either need a snack or need help with a math problem? God help me if any of our kids needed help with math problems, right? And so those are the kind of things that I think are lost on some of the discussions. And again, not implying that it's lost on any of you on this call, but knowing the importance of that. I do think there's something else, and Nancy, you feel free to chime in now as soon as I'm about to be done with my diatribe. So thank you. But I do think there's something that I haven't thought about too much. As you are articulating this acute pandemic of COVID-19 with the much more chronic pandemic of racism and systemic oppression and every single phobia known to man and woman and person. The reality is, particularly for people from underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, they haven't been able to emote, to vent, to catharsis around these issues, particularly around issues of social inequality, because there hasn't been much that we can do about it. If you think about it, what's the point of quote unquote complaining if nothing will change? And yet over the last year, and COVID has personified health inequity after health inequity after health inequity, people have been voicing this frustration. And I don't know about you, but every now and again, if I work out too hard, I hurt something. If I run too fast, or maybe I'm on the Peloton too long, I'm in a little bit more pain than I thought I was going to be. And I feel good about it, right? Because I've sweated and I've let it all out, but I tweaked something in the process. And I wonder how many of our staff and faculty in this year of maybe finding their voice and maybe cathartic find themselves going, wow, I didn't know I felt that way. I thought about it, maybe talked to a friend, but never had elevated that to a supervisor. Never had put that on Instagram. Never had talked to my my spiritual healer about it. Never talked to my mom about the pain that I carried for X number of years. And yeah, I'm glad I let it out. I now don't know what to do about that. And in some ways, and then I'll stop. And in some ways, I think this is why, particularly in this week with the murder of Dante Wright, and as the Derek Chauvin trial goes on in Minnesota, I think there are so many folks who have this level of numbness of, after a year, and in some cases decades of emoting and catharsis, I'm like almost really tired, almost really spent with the catharsis. So on one hand, I'm glad I did it. And on the other hand, I don't know what comes next. So I think those are the kind of realities that a lot of faculty and staff find themselves in, not just people from underrepresented groups. I think all of us are struggling with these realities in this day.
No, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about a talk I gave a couple of weeks ago on this very topic. And what I found astounding was the chat, actually. Maybe because what I was saying was boring, I don't know, but the chat was blowing up. I mean, the people, it was faculty and staff primarily, a few administrators, but mostly faculty and staff. And the need for connection around these issues that you're talking about, we may each do our own workout, to use your words, our own thinking about this and processing it and experiencing it, but there's something about coming together. Again, back to you, you're not alone. The need for connection, the chat was going wild, supporting one another. And it made me think about, not just during the pandemic, but even before and as we move hopefully out of the pandemic, what opportunities do we provide for faculty and staff to connect, to have a space? I mean, again, we think about these things for students, but I'm not so sure institutions at large really think about, how do we provide a sense of connection and belonging and collectivity, if you will, for faculty and staff? Is that something that, maybe I'm moving ahead, something that we can think about systemically, because I think these things are just, they're not, obviously, hopefully they don't fly off our radar again, right? And we don't bury things. We are at a place where this is going to be a new day, right? But we're going to need a lot of support, and a lot of connection. And I could just see from that chat how dire people felt. It was wonderful to see, but made me think, okay, what's going on here? And I guess I also was thinking, you talked a lot about how staff really, I think I sometimes I feel like they are put in the back seat, that they're not, they're thought of sort of as an afterthought, which of course they play such a central role in the development of students that doesn't make any sense, but that is the silo that exists in our institutions. And I've been thinking about, oftentimes their role has been to be such a support for students. What I remember when I was on a campus, my administrative assistant knew way more about the students that came to our office than the clinicians knew. The students that was their support person, and that happens across campus, but it wasn't just in our office. And I was thinking about, as we've moved to remote instruction, a lot of that has begun to fall to faculty. And not to say that faculty haven't been, go-to people for students in the past, but oftentimes in the pandemic, faculty might have been the only contact that a student had with the institution, right? Because it's so hard to do the other support services remotely, that I think faculty also have a challenge, back to the challenges of how do I know, especially remotely, how can I tell if a student might be struggling, and what should I say, and what would I do if they did reveal that they were having a challenge? I can't just walk them over to the counseling center or bring them to the dean's office or whatever. So I think challenges abound on many levels.
So thank you both for those wonderful and insightful answers. And that leads to my next question, which is actually a two-part question. So what are some systemic ways that we, those of us who are on this webinar, administrators, people leading institutions, can be a part of supporting staff and faculty? And how do we incorporate some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic? And what do you see as some of those lessons learned?
Thanks for that question, Liz. I'll get us started, Nancy, because frankly, you left me a really great seed when you used the word systemic. I think for those of us on this call who have any sort of agency or privilege or leadership role, and we all have some level of agency or privilege or leadership, regardless of the system, I like to think about it using 3 A's. For me, it comes down to awareness, advocacy, and accountability. Regardless of the table that you're sitting at, whether you're in the dean's office or whether you're a department chair, maybe you're a president or a provost or a vice chancellor or a vice provost. I think as you come to workshops or town halls like this, and as you are commiserating with your peers at other institutions, when your awareness gets raised, when you become aware of the dichotomy between the experience for staff and faculty, or the dichotomy between exempt and non-exempt staff, Don't take for granted the fact that other people may not know that information. I've had the privilege of being a member of the senior cabinet here for almost 3 years. And there are accountants on that senior cabinet. There are innovative thinkers on that senior cabinet. There's general counsel on that senior cabinet. There's a person for D&I on that senior cabinet. And so there's so many things I don't know about, whether it's legal cases, and our general counsel is always willing to teach me a thing or three about it, or our senior VP for administration, who's always willing to teach me more than a thing or two about accounting, right? Or about GAAP, and you'll have to look up what that stands for, because if I learned it, you can too. But the reality is, I find myself in a lot of places where my awareness is raised. And if I don't use that seat to make sure that everybody knows of these issues, for example, the child care and the elderly care issue, then I'm not maximizing not only my seat, but trying to start the conversation on how we systemically increase access or decrease stress. So I'm a big believer in awareness. The advocacy part, I think, is the part that I like to tread lightly in. So full disclosure, I'm a full professor. I have the ability of always falling back on that. That's a pretty good fallback gig if you can get it. I'm also on a senior cabinet. And so I don't assume that everybody has the same amount of privileges that I do, but I'll acknowledge the ones that I do. And so it's important for me to advocate on behalf of the groups that I'm trying to increase people's awareness around. So not only am I acknowledging the fact that we need to do more about childcare, but now I'm presenting ways of improving it, whether it's finding funds or working with a nonprofit, or whether it's trying to figure out where we have empty office space, or whatever the case may be. How can I not only increase the knowledge of those around me, but even present some sort of solutions? And when those solutions get batted down, how do I not get discouraged by having that one solution batted down, but then going back and finding 2 more or 3 more, or calling someone and saying, what are you doing there that might work here? Advocacy is hard work, and it's also really rewarding work. Not so much for you, but more so for the folks that you're trying to elevate and speak on behalf of. And then the last one is accountability. So you get 3 in here today, right? Awareness, advocacy, accountability. The accountability one is important though, because for me, I think it's important that if you're going to institute any sort of systemic changes, you make accountability a spectrum versus a binary. I'm a big believer in that concept. If you've ever heard me talk, you're already probably fallen asleep, right? I hope you're not, because it really is important, particularly for leaders, to stop making things about a zero-sum game or a yes or no. Accountability isn't about getting it right all the time. It's about acknowledging the times that you got it right and why, and the times that you got it wrong and how to improve on that. So if you never get that widget that you were after, if you never get 100% pay raise for somebody in the staff realm, it doesn't mean that a 15% pay raise or a 4% pay raise would be all for naught, right? And so I just think that so long as we can focus on maybe in a way demystifying systemic change. Oh, that sounds really, really hard. Well, it is. But if you apply that lens of awareness and advocacy and accountability, chances are you'll get further down the road of making these things better systemically. And notice I haven't talked too much about individual, more tangible things, which we've got colleagues on the call who will do later. The last thing I'll say is whatever tangible offers or ideas we have, they'll stick. They'll be more sustainably ingrained into the concept of that institution if you attack these things at a systemic level. If not, there'll only ever be an initiative or a program or something that was really, really popular for a day or a week or a month and then just goes away and doesn't have that impact that you'd like it to have. So those are my thoughts on instituting systemic change. Nancy, what do you got?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you had a dream last night to key me up for this, because what you're talking about is what, at Jed, we've learned in our work with schools. If you don't have support from your senior folks on campus, and you don't have a strategic plan in place that clearly identifies the things that you want to tackle with concrete steps, then just what you said happens. It goes by the wayside. Someone has a good idea for 6 months, and it's implemented for a short period of time, and then it's often lost or certainly not sustained. And so when you want to talk about that's the work we do on campuses, is affect systemic change. And you can only do that by having a diverse group of people working with you on campus from all walks of life on campus, support from senior leaders, and the development of a concrete strategic plan once you identify, the goals and the things that you want to carry forward, and tracking your progress on that strategic plan, right? And so I think, we've talked so much about the challenges of the pandemic, of which there are many, but I also think we've learned certain things as a result of the pandemic, one of which I talked about a minute ago, and you're mentioning as well. What do faculty and staff need, right? Do they need more childcare? Do they need in my mind, is one of the things that I hope is here to stay is flexibility for faculty. I mean, you mentioned faculty have more flexibility anyway, and that's true oftentimes, especially tenured faculty. But what about adjuncts? What about staff? They have the same whole lives as faculty do. They have kids, they have they have parents who need help, they have family members, people have lost jobs. I mean, we need to hold on to the things that we've had to shift to allow for, like flexibility, and not have that go away when we come back to campus, right? So some of the things that we've allowed for that have helped people be more of a whole person. I'm not just a teacher or a counselor or a facilities manager, but I also am a dad or a partner or a son, whatever it might be that we are. And the institution needs to allow for flexibility in that regard. And I think it's only now at most institutions that we're beginning to wake up to see that, the people that work here are whole people with multiple things going on in their lives. So I hope systemically there's a way to maintain some of that with new policies, and time away, yeah, that folks can have within reason, obviously, depending on what your job is. But I think we need to begin to think creatively of how can we continue to support what we started to see in the pandemic when we come back to campus. And I think flexibility is a big one. I think the other thing that you mentioned, you know, not every school is going to be able to have a childcare center or, a number of services that we would all love to see. But what about partnering with community agencies? What about, potential stipends for support with childcare? I mean, there's many creative ways we can begin to address what this sort of climate has brought to the foreground that we all need. And why not survey faculty and staff and find out, what are the three things that you would wish for most, again, within reason, that would help you feel more supported as a person and as an employee at X university. And let's take that data and really, hone in on where are the themes, where are the trends, and what can we do about it? Because I do think if you want to affect systemic change, you really have to think long and hard and have a concrete plan in place that has the support of a cross section and senior folks on your campus. And you mentioned repeatedly the cabinet. I think the board of trustees as well. I mean, we need buy-in from all the folks that can contribute here.
So, Liz, good luck getting a word in. I know you got another question for us, but Nancy's given us like 117 gems. I'm only going to pick on 2 or 3, Nancy, but I think they're really important frankly, for me to hear and for others on this call to hear. On one end, you challenged us to survey faculty and survey staff and make sure that we have a clear idea as to what they need. Here's the thing about this horrible pandemic and the social strife that we've had. Faculty and staff, particularly this year, staff and faculty, have been clearly and succinctly and specifically sharing what their needs are. I mean, we've heard about the importance of flexibility. We've heard about the importance of professional development. We've heard about the importance of, making sure that we honor their gifts and their talents. We've had, for better and for worse, I would argue much worse, but we've had a years-long focus group of so many members of our community that lift up our community, letting us know what they need. Let's act on that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't formally survey it, but let's not squander the information that these individuals have given us, so that particularly the things that we've heard time and time and time again, for example, professional development opportunities for staff, that at the very least, if not mirror, acknowledge what we give faculty, let's do some of that. And I realize that means reallocating resources. But the other thing that I took away from your point is this notion of strategic plans, right? So much of our strategic plans are around student needs and academic needs and the needs of the community and diversity and equity needs. What about staff and faculty needs? What about the overall well-being of staff and faculty? What about having metrics on how grateful and how successful our folks are, and how we get that to a better place, right? I mean, to me, it's a challenge, Nancy, right? It's not coming back out of this year and a half of pain to that new normal. So many folks, I was struck by what LaToya shared a few points ago. The notion of like the emotion of thank you, Nancy, for acknowledging what you had around the way you had around the needs of staff. We can't go back to a normal. There is no normal, even if we reach whatever herd immunity gets to. The fact of the matter is, now that we're aware of these systemic discrepancies, for us to go back to a normal where we continue to put in the back seat or in the trunk the needs of our staff and faculty because our students or because somebody else is more important, more relevant, that doesn't do a lot with the data that we've been provided, and more importantly, with the heart and soul that we've provided from our staff and our faculty. So I go back to what can we do to change this system? Act on the great information and the sometimes tough and harrowing information that our colleagues have given us, right? Thanks, Nancy. It's just you in the chat have got my mind going a million miles an hour, but that strategic plan and incorporating staff and faculty needs in there, again, not implying that it's not at the institutions that are represented here, but if they are, how are we monitoring that? And if they're not, how do we get that in there too? So that it's not just about the engaged liberal arts or about diversity and inclusion representation, but also staff and faculty validation and the experiences of them and their families. These are the people that make our universities tick.
You know, I have just one last thing to say, and then I will stop, Liz, so you can get on with the program. But you know, we know, and the data has shown us again and again and again, that students who are struggling emotionally, students who are stressed, who are not well emotionally, and I don't mean have a psychiatric diagnosis, but are struggling. They do not do well academically. They often don't make it to graduation. I mean, we know that there's a significant connection between well-being and academic success and retention. That's been documented again and again and again with student data. It's no leap to assume that the same thing is true for staff and faculty, right? If we're not well, if we're struggling, we're not going to be our best selves as faculty, as staff members, whatever our role is on campus. So it's also in the service, of the university to think about promoting wellness across student, faculty, and staff as part of the mission of the university, because ultimately our mission is to get students to graduation, to be successful citizens in the world, productive lives. That's not going to happen unless all of us on campus are well held, I guess is how I would say it, and that we recognize that well-being equates to whether it's academic performance, job performance, what have you. It's a huge impact. They are significantly correlated. And so let's start paying attention to that and seeing what we can do to promote it.
Yeah, Nancy, I was looking for the clapping feature to agree, but Liz turned it off, so I couldn't give you the reaction I was hoping to. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Liz.
So you both kind of touched on this, and then I received a question. So what are some more of the tangible ways that we can support these populations on our campuses, especially with the lens that resources may be tight in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? So thinking about both short-term and long-term, what are some of the more tangible things, and especially with restricted resources?
I'll get us going, Lancey, if that's all right with you, and
Sure.
then we can just do what we've been doing, which has been playing tennis, right? Right, mental tennis. I think for me, I'll take a page out of the business world. ERGs, employee resource groups, are something is a tool that is not exactly very expensive, providing a space and a place where colleagues who share an affinity, whether that is an identity or a race or an ethnicity, or in some ERGs, it's something that folks might gravitate towards, something they have in common. But not only providing the virtual and or physical space for those colleagues to get together, but also whatever support they might need to communicate their concerns and their successes with administrators or their supervisors is important. Nancy and I have both talked about this notion of not being alone. We call that universality. And cohesion is actually the process of being in proximity to someone. So the concepts of universality, I'm not alone, and cohesion, I'm actually not that far away from people, are really, really important concepts. The downside to the Zoom world is that you don't actually get to do something like this in a personal, more physical, tangible way. The upside is I can connect with people in Connecticut and folks in Colorado and still not feel like I'm alone, right? So ERGs is one of the ways I would look at it. At our institution, we have literally just provided seed money, and I'm literally saying a few $100s, right? And have decided to let we meet with as diverse a group of faculty and staff as we possibly can at the beginning of every semester, and then these basically organic, homegrown, grassroots groups of folks self-identify, and then let our office know if they need dollars or supports, or even getting the word out that this group is meeting on Zoom this day. An example of how this worked effectively for us is right after March 16th, which was the day of the horrible shooting in Atlanta that targeted Asian American and Pacific Islanders. This affinity group that, again, was homegrown, all we did was provide just the space for them to all meet for the first time, reached out and provided support to themselves, and then also were in contact with my office for any resources or affirmations that they needed. We've not always done that whole notion of affinity groups and supporting them, at least not in higher ed. I don't know what the reasons are for that, but we are much more in tune now with the necessity and also the availability of these resource groups. And so whatever you call them, affinity groups, ERGs, I just think it's important to provide that as a tangible resource. And what office provides them? It could be the Human Resources Office. It could be the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. It can be the Provost Office. I mean, they don't have to live in any one particular place, but they need to be started, if you will. And once you're able to provide the runway for that, then folks acknowledge that, oh, they that office, that administrator sees me and is creating space for me and my colleagues as well. So that's one idea.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to space, I mean, it's back to sort of what I was talking about early on when I was saying, the chat was blowing up on a talk I had given previously, because people crave coming together and being able to talk about what's going on, both positive and negative, right? And share ideas, share thoughts, share challenges. I think in addition to space, we need to think about time, right? Because I think back again to what you talked about with faculty, the schedules are more flexible. There may be more opportunity for people to have time to come together. I think for staff, oftentimes there is no time. I work from, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or whatever it might be, and I have a half hour for lunch. So I think, when am I going to have an affinity group where I can, there might be a space for me, but you have to give me time to go there, right? And so thinking, again, I suppose in some ways there is a cost to that, giving people time, but I think it's a minimal cost. We're not asking for, huge increase in salary. We may be asking for an hour worth of time once a week for people to come together, should they choose to do so in a group, affinity group. So I think space and time, and I think, both of those things provide validation. And I think validation that we hear you, we know this is hard work. We know that we all have challenges and successes, and when we need to be able to talk about our challenges and celebrate our successes and come together to do that. And I think we also have to give people the time to do that as well. And I don't think that, in my experience when I was on campuses, and I was on quite a few, that didn't happen very often, especially for staff.
Liz, I know we're at time, almost 1:45, as we wanted to turn it over, but Nancy reminded me of one last thing, and I think it's pretty tangible. We've talked about it a bit already. Remote work policies. Early on in the pandemic, big companies, the ones that you would expect, right? Twitter and Google and a lot of the tech companies started not only acknowledging that their colleagues could go home and work, but even that they might be closing up some of those office spaces and that they wouldn't even expect their folks to come back, right? I think that, so first of all, we've got a remote work policy at Wake. I'm assuming most folks have a remote work policy. It's one of those kind of standard HR tools, right? To not at the very least explore how to change and update and embed more flexibility, thank you, Nancy, for that word, into the remote work policy going into AY22, which starts, I guess, for us on July 1. To not do that would be a pretty big squandering of an opportunity to improve something. That is also one of those tangible things. And again, Nancy, to your point, it comes with a cost, right? The cost is either the stress of being uncomfortable around whether or not someone should be allowed to work from home 3 days a week, or maybe even permanently. I get it. The other cost is losing control. I'm not, how am I supposed to keep an eye, quote unquote, on a person who I've always either expected to see when I walk in the door or just assume they're there, right? But if they're being just as successful or more successful, or Nancy, to your words, right? If they feel better about what they're doing and they just happen to be at home, as administrators and as institutions, we've got some pretty big decisions to make, right? Or at least some pretty courageous ones. And as I say every now and again, these things are complex, but they're not that complicated. And I think, again, our colleagues are expecting us to change something. Like, can we possibly come back from this pandemic? Can we possibly come back from a year and change and decades of social strife and it's all back to normal? Like, why? Why is that? So there's something tangible. All right, Liz. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we will move into our audience Q&A, and to get us started, Angela Lindner, Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs at the University of Florida, has asked, can you speak to the value, or should I say valuing, of face-to-face engagement in the workplace and classrooms? Where does this conversation fit into the overall discussion in work location of faculty and staff? And could we enjoy both flexible workplaces and transformational face-to-face engagement?
Yeah, as a psychologist who also was in private practice for many years, my bias is, it's hard to replace face-to-face communication. And I've been Zooming, for the past year and a half, as have all of you. And it's wonderful in the ways that you described, Jose. I can reach many, many colleagues I normally would never see face-to-face anyway. or see at all. But there is something very valuable about face-to-face interactions, both for faculty and students in a learning capacity in the classroom, but also certainly for the staff on campus. I think, especially if you think about student services staff, you know, so many important relationships form between students and staff on campus, and those form in a face-to-face way. Um, and I think faculty have been able to maintain more connection with students remotely than staff have been able to. So I think a lot has been lost in that regard, and face-to-face will really help. But I do think that the other side of that is back to what Jose and I have both said a number of times now. You know, how can we be flexible about that? It doesn't need to be a one or the other. It can be a what do you call it? A plus and, or whatever whatever that phrase is, that both can happen simultaneously. You can have some remote, some flexibility, some and people will feel differently. Some people in my office can't wait to get back to the office face to face. You know, so let's hear again, what would you like to do, Nancy? And how would that fit into the work culture at X institution, right? And then try and negotiate, you know, do I want to have 1 day a week where I work from home because I really enjoy the face-to-face? A both and is what I was looking for a minute ago. A both and situation where we can incorporate both of those opportunities, and people can choose depending on what their job requirements are. But let's not narrowly define that. Let's really think creatively, because I think we have said, oh, your job could never be remote. And of course, we've learned many jobs can be remote. So again, one of those things, let's not lose some of the things we've learned from the pandemic that really can work.
Yeah, I mean, just taking a page out of that, Nancy, one of the things that we've learned from the pandemic, and this is something that comes up with my staff from time to time, is this idea of, you know what, Jose, this meeting would have been a really good email. And I don't take it disrespectfully. It's just like, yeah, we have this expectation, and Angela used the word valuing in quotes on purpose, right? Like, is it truly that face-to-face interactions are valuable, or do we just value them more than these virtual connections? Angela, in full disclosure, I'm a really relational person, and I learned that relational side of myself at the University of Florida. So go Gators, right? All of my degrees I got from Florida, I'm as relational as they come because of that. What I've learned over the last couple of semesters is this: number one, not everyone values relational relationships the way that I do, and number two, I can tone it down from time to time as well. And so when you ask your question, you know, where does this discussion fit into the conversation? I think that the mere fact of challenging these assumptions that students can only benefit if they're in the classroom all the time. Our team can only function if it's ever in connection to each other all the time. We can only have a retreat if we, you know, go off into the mountains or into, I don't know, Devil's Mill Hopper in Gainesville, Florida, just north of campus, for like a picnic for 3 hours. Do we have to? We might prefer to. It might be funner or cooler or whatever other words end in ER, but are they necessary? Well, they might not be. And so I just encourage you to, you know, take the lessons that Nancy's taught us all today on the importance of flexibility. I think your team will feel more valued if you're even willing to have the discussion. And LaToya, by the way, is by far everyone's favorite on the box. LaToya continues to challenge us, rightfully so, and we don't center staff and faculty enough. So when we have these discussions as to the valuing of face-to-face engagement, our knee jerk is to think about students, as we should. I realize they pay tuition and or they're bringing in federal dollars through financial aid. I get that. But we have to have a very serious discussion on how students value face-to-face engagement and how staff value face-to-face engagement and how faculty value face-to-face engagement, and have a very genuine discussion on, have we overvalued what students want at the expense of what faculty and staff need? And if we've done that, then we've got some more serious conversations to be had. It's not that the pendulum swings the other way, But even the fact that we spent 5 minutes just kind of kicking around Angela's awesome question, because she works at UF, that's an important part of these discussions that we don't often have.
You know, I was also just seeing in the chat, someone made a comment, talking back and forth about flexibility. And one of the comments was, oftentimes it depends on who you report to. And that just can't be, right? Because if Jose and I are, doing the same job and he's reporting to someone that allows flexibility and I'm not, that's not going to go over well for me. It's certainly not going to help morale, and it's not going to help me be a good employee. So I think we need to, again, we'll go back to the systemic question, look at our policies systemically and apply them equitably. And again, not every job might be able to be as flexible as others, but it needs to be regulated and organized in a way that allows for fairness and equity across the board. I mean, we talk about this even, on a different level when we talk about, encouraging faculty and staff to reach out to students when they think something might be going on, when they might be struggling. And what happens is certain faculty and staff are champions of this, and they do it all the time. They do it sort of just regularly and naturally. And then there's others that will never do it. Or if they're evaluating whether or not a student they shouldn't be in this position, but sometimes come back from a leave, or take a leave. If I'm not somebody who's empathic to mental health issues and I'm a faculty member, I might say, no way. Whereas someone else would be very, amenable because they're understanding the whole student. And those are the kinds of things that we need to change, right? That I shouldn't have a different experience than Jose just because of who my faculty member is or who my supervisor is. And those speak to systemic changes and policy changes.
Yeah, and I did the group a favor, Nancy, by putting your quote in the chat box in APA style. That is fantastic. Like that is the kind of thing that I will put up over my screen for all of us to look at our policies systemically and then apply them equitably. Roy 2021.
Wow. So I think we have time for one more question, and the chat has been blowing up, especially around the topic of how do our institutions show that they value or not value staff, and the difference between exempt and non-exempt staff. And so, final question, how can we help our institutions prioritize and show that they do value all staff, maybe not just exempt staff, and any last thoughts that you have about how we demonstrate the value of staff, because they are such a critical part of our institutions?
So I've got an answer. One of it is a hashtag, and then the other one is something for us to, and then the other one is a question. The hashtag is the reallocation of resources. We need to reallocate some of our resources to our exempt and non-exempt staff if we're ever going to make them feel seen, heard, and valued, period. Now, what that reallocation of resources mean depends on the size of your endowment. It depends on where you get your funding from. It depends on a lot of things. But actively looking at the reallocation of resources is important. So what's the question? The question is, how do we do for group X what we're doing for group Y? And so if we're providing professional development opportunities for faculty, how are we doing it for exempt staff? And how are we doing it for non-exempt staff? That's it. They don't have to be equal. We all on this call should and do understand that equality and equity are two very, very different things. So I'm not championing the fact that everyone gets the same number of dollars to get professional development, or no. But if you ask that question, how do we do for group X and Y what we've done for group Z, then it at least pushes you, it challenges you to have that more deeper discussion on, we may need to reallocate some resources. That's what I've got.
You know, I often live in a fantasy world where I see only the glass half full. And I would love to see equal policies. Not, I mean, salaries are always going to vary depending on skill set, depending on, you know, what your job is. Um, but I think policies, there are certain standard policies that can be equal across exempt, non-exempt, and faculty, staff and faculty. And so I think we also need to look at where are those places? Yes, there's going to be places where there's going to be variability, but where are the places where there can be things? What about time off? About time of day that you work? You know, I saw someone in the chat saying, you know, am I supposed to work 9 to 5? You know, if I have, you know, young children or whatever it might be, you know, if my job allows for, I don't need to be present necessarily for a meeting or what have you. I might work from 8 to 10 at night when my kids go to bed. I mean, those kinds of things need to be standard, no matter what your job is, as long as your job allows for that kind of sort of arranging of your day. There's small things that, and big things, big policies as well around time off and around what you can get time off for. Do I have to use a sick day? Do I get a mental health day? If my kid's sick? You know, all of those things should be, and I don't think they are at many institutions, standard across categories of employees. So I think that there's room to look at our policies systemically and really see where the inequities are and where can we make them more equal and equitable.
Well, I think I speak for everyone in the audience when I say thank you for tackling a very important and very difficult set of topics. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Jose. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. And as Steve posted in the chat, we still have representatives from 3 of our member campuses who are going to be sharing some of the tangible things that campuses are doing right now to support staff and faculty. So I will turn it over to Megan Kennedy from the University of Washington.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Jose and Nancy, for that really fun, rich, important conversation. I want to acknowledge that, like Wake Forest, the University of Washington is also a campus that participated in the Jed Campus program between 2016 and 2020. And I'm about to kind of shift our conversation from this, the one part of this comprehensive approach that's been about the system change that's required, and the need for us to examine our policies, to one that is based more on a specific program that we're leading at the University of Washington. And I just want to acknowledge that the program that I'm going to be talking about, Be Real, was really inspired by the JED's comprehensive approach and us really thinking about how can we reduce the burden on the counseling center, and start to think about inviting our entire campus community to take responsibility for mental health and well-being. And then in doing so, how do we equip staff and faculty to have the types of resilience and skills to be able to do that effectively, and to be taking care of themselves along the way. I'm also a therapist, so I'm the third on the call who's coming from that lens. I did a lot of work in youth and family therapy, and when I think about a child coming into my office, I often was thinking about how do we support the parents, or how do we zoom out and look at the whole system of this family. And I think that the same is true. We could apply that same systems perspective to campuses when we think about how do we support staff and faculty in supporting the students on our campus. So I'm going to transition now to talk about this program, Be Real. I have about 6 or 7 minutes to do so, so bear with me as I talk fairly quickly about a program that I'm pretty excited about. So the program is called Be Real. It was started by one of our centers in the Department of Psychology at the UW called the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing. And as a director of the Resilience Lab, our unit, the lab, has been supporting the implementation of this program across campus. Be Real is a 6-week program. Each group is 90 minutes, and it's the underpinning of Be Real is based in mindfulness-based stress reduction and dialectical behavioral therapy. We originally implemented Be Real. I'm going to go back one. We originally implemented Be Real at the within residence halls at the University of Washington to students, and we studied the effectiveness of this group using a waitlist control trial. And what we found is that students were more able to like manage their stress and emotions and felt more of a sense of connection. After that project was over, we decided to think about how do we start to consider how to bring this program to students across campus beyond the residence halls, and specifically address the need to like increase access among students who have barriers to accessing counseling. And so we reached into our community, invited staff from across our 3 campuses at the UW to participate in Be Real. And to actually go through the program themselves so that they could then, even as non-clinicians, lead Be Real in their respective communities. We also assessed the feasibility of non-clinicians leading Be Real across campus. And we had staff participating and continue to from all across the university, from academic departments to our LGBTQ center, ethnic cultural center, Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity, residence halls. And then these staff have the option of leading Be Real in these different communities if they want to. We've also, which is what I want to talk about today, been starting to be pretty interested in what's happening, which is by inviting staff to participate in Be Real, we're starting to notice that it's having a really positive impact on their mental health and well-being. And so we're also assessing that, not just their kind of satisfaction with the Be Real and the training and learning how to be a facilitator and the feasibility of them facilitating across campus, to promote student mental health and well-being, but really like what's the effect on them in their own lives. And so a few nuts and bolts that I wanted to share. The sessions are 90 minutes. They are led by staff from the Center for Child and Family Wellbeing in the lab. Usually groups have about 15 staff. We've had 157 staff members from across campus participate over the last 2 years. We adapted the program last spring to be on Zoom, so all sessions have been on Zoom for the last full academic year. In between the groups, participants receive a weekly newsletter where they can just practice adapting the skills and concepts learned in their daily lives at work, but also in their homes. It includes like a recap of guided practices, worksheets, recordings that they can listen to. And then, as mentioned, the staff can participate in a facilitator training where they can elect to be able to lead this group for students within their respective communities. And we've had about 70 staff or so participate in that facilitator training, and then some of those staff go on to lead these groups. However, we also are assessing where staff are applying these skills. So we hear stories of staff talking about the application of the skills within team meetings, the culture of their departments changing as a result of learning these skills and practices. And then they also share with us stories of how they're applying the skills at home as well. And lastly, a new community of practice is forming among these staff members, because I think that the parallel process that Nancy was referring to of like what we know students needing and what's required to support the whole student is also true for staff. And so staff are finding a lot of benefit from having a greater sense of connection and from being with each other. And so after the 6 weeks, they're kind of desiring that time to continue practicing the practices, to consult with each other about facilitation and to share resources and to be with each other. So let's see here. This is a quote from one of the academic advisors. I will read. It just says, "I entered into the Be Real training to learn new ways to help my students in their academic success. I was pleasantly surprised at how much it taught me about my own self-care. I learned how to be more mindful about my day and to find strategies to relax and take care of myself, even for 2 minutes in the midst of a hectic job, and learn to be more accepting with my own flaws and still be able to work on this judgment and expectations. And I even use these strategies like breathing and going for walks with my kiddo at home." So this gives you that idea of how we're noticing and learning from staff about this kind of dual application of how it's helping them support themselves at work, support students by modeling the skills or applying the skills in their work, serving students in the residence halls or as academic advisors and so on and so forth, but then also these skills helping them at home as well. I also wanted to talk about kind of where we're heading with Be Real, because I think that there's a really important piece around when it comes to teaching skills and practices around resilience, for us to think about how the expectation or the onus can't necessarily be on, or the belief can't be like, if we teach people skills and practices to support their resilience, like that's kind of the end point, then they'll be able to manage the stress that's around, right? The Resilience Lab is really taking a firm look at how do we need to address like the conditions in the environment in order to support people's resilience. And I really value this quote that it comes from a recent Q&A from Dr. Janine Jones, who's a professor of school psychology at our College of Education at the UW. And this came from a Q&A in Education Week, where she's talking about how, you know, we can't just learn these skills and practices in a vacuum. We have to think about the skills and practices as like being in context. For example, using these skills and practices in relationship with one another. And that this has specific importance, what she's arguing here, for students of color. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it really connects to where we're heading with Be Real, which is thinking about, as we've been navigating these dual pandemics, and the one that Nancy and Jose were talking about regarding systemic racism, we're really thinking about like, well, how can these skills and concepts be used in terms of addressing racism? And so we are in the process of building a new training series that will explore how we can integrate the resilience coping skills and the mindfulness and compassion-based practices that we teach in Be Real to support anti-racist work, and specifically to get to what I think Jose was referring to as catharsis, and what we're talking about is racial dialogue fatigue or racial exhaustion in this work. And so I look forward to being able to share more about the kind of future of Be Real and the intersection we're creating here at a future date. But I'm going to pause there and turn it over to my other colleagues to share about their programs. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Megan. And now we'll turn it over to Angie Brown from the University of Florida.
Thanks, Liz. Everybody can see my screen okay, I'm hoping. Megan, I really appreciated, kind of had a really granular program that she could share with us. I'm going to paint a much more broad stroke. And so I encourage you, if you have questions of anything that I'm going to kind of go over, to feel free to ask if something in particular piques your interest here. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble. So our team is a UFHR Communications and Work Life. We're based in the Office of Human Resources at the University of Florida. And we are focused on largely communications is a big part of our effort, but in recent years have built out a significant work-life and wellness programming and initiatives to better support our faculty and staff. So we see these as being interconnected. And so our goal is to have a healthy, productive, informed, and engaged community through strategic communications. We do change management, programming, and initiatives that'll support well-being and work-life integration. We know that, as we've been talking about it a lot today, is our work and our life are inherently interdependent. So part of our approach through communications is listening. And so you'll see here, we have a newsletter that goes out twice a week, but we also have social media platforms that we deploy content on. And then we also do some careful listening to what faculty and staff are saying, so that we are in tune with that and attuned to the needs that we're finding are out there, and then are able to better develop programs and communication suited to those needs. We offer in-person and on-demand programs, of course. Increasingly over the last year, those have been offered virtually, which works out well. We have employees throughout the state that we need to stay mindful of, and so we've been able to offer more programming virtually that's kind of forced us into that, and actually helped people throughout the state as a result. We've held a number of town halls over the last year, so that's another way that we listen in. So we offer the opportunity for experts or administrators on campus to be able to share information, but also hopefully, using change management principles early enough before a change is happening, or early on within that change, that people have an opportunity to voice their concerns along the way. And so we're able to attune again to in our approach. So several years ago, we developed what we call our Windows to Wellness model. This is specific to our wellness initiatives. And it was particularly, I think, important for today's discussion that we don't consider that any one aspect of an employee's well-being exists in isolation. So we're talking about mental health quite a bit today, but we know that somebody's financial well-being is inherently going to affect their emotional well-being, or if they aren't feeling well emotionally, it's going to be difficult for them to do physical activity. And likewise, if they're not doing physical activity, their emotional well-being may suffer. So we see these as interrelated, and yet we're keeping an eye on them distinctly as opportunities to develop programming, knowing that kind of like pool balls on a pool table, one will kind of hit the other and hopefully have a positive effect. This Windows to Wellness model used to be 8 dimensions, which is pretty common among wellness programs, if any of you are affiliated with wellness programs at your university. But we recently added this down in the bottom corner, the cultural window, because like Megan was just saying, we're increasingly realizing that that is a distinct and important component to look at independently, as well as, of course, within each of these other areas. So we're trying to give that a bit more attention and focus than we may have in the past. So I'm not going to go into all of the kinds of programs that we've developed. This just gives you kind of a glance at the types of programs and services, not only that we offer, but we also look for what's being available throughout our campus. So we partner with the Office of Sustainability, who offers our UF Bikes programs, our community supported agriculture, our food pantry. We work closely with our Training and Development Office, which is here in the Office of Human Resources, to help amplify messages that they're putting out, whether it's our Stronger Together initiative that addresses anti-racism, those kinds of things. But a few high points I think that are particularly important given our discussion today. Our Resilient Gators program, we've been offering for about a year, but became increasingly important. And we've also begun offering Introduction to Mindfulness. And we're now looking at a way to kind of integrate those into a 5-part resiliency and mindfulness program that we've been piloting with our business administrator staff through that program this spring, and with pretty good success in helping people to manage some of the anxiety and stress that they've been experiencing. So we've piloted that program and anticipate that we'll expand that out to offer throughout our faculty and staff. And I think what we're finding is that it may work best for us to do that within communities. So communities of practice, whether that be our financial administrators, whether that be student affairs staff, the different types of groups, because then it gives them also a chance to, have an opportunity for catharsis with one another to kind of have that shared experience. Our Get Connected directory, we launched just prior to the pandemic. So that was an effort to promote some of the affinity programs, like Jose was talking about the importance of affinity programs on campus for, especially as large as the University of Florida is, it's incredibly important for people to find others of similar backgrounds or interests to connect with, especially if they're new to the area. And then also to get connected in the community. So that directory has not only listings of opportunities on campus, but also within, especially the Gainesville and Alachua County area. If you're interested in beekeeping, if you're interested in kayaking, lots of different areas to get connected with people quickly through this directory. So we launched that, like I said, just prior to the pandemic. And of course, everybody kind of went remote. And so we had to kind of do some updating to make sure people knew how they could still get connected, even remotely through various opportunities. We've put some additional focus on grief and coping and partnered with a faculty member who offers workshops in this, and we're developing an on-demand program because we know over the past year, grief and coping, whether it's related to COVID or the social issues that have been happening throughout the country, have had a tremendous impact, and people are struggling with that. So we're putting a focus on that issue. Under environmental wellness, we have walking maps that we developed last summer so that people can get out. We knew people were a little bit cooped up and there were opportunities to get out and get active, get some fresh air. And so we developed some campus walking maps for people to, that kind of have times associated with them so they could find ways to get out and walk together, separate but together, and encourage people to do that. We have a financial literacy series that we launched this spring. And part of the impetus for that was the knowledge that there was a possibility of furloughs coming. We still haven't luckily had to have those, but we knew that that might be a possibility and that there were other worries that people had related to finances, as we all do, given the effects of the pandemic. So we've been offering that with a number of our campus partners and programs to ensure that people have information on how they can save better and strategies for the future. We have a summer camps directory that we're actually promoting very heavily right now alongside a webinar series so that people can get the latest information on what our summer camps in the area are doing to ensure their children are protected and if they need to identify them. Typically, we have an event in the spring where people can actually come and meet with the various summer camps, but again, we're having to offer that virtually this year. But we know that that's a concern to people to find good places. If they do need to come back, as increasingly it's looking like this summer, we will have to make sure that people are on campus, that they're going to need good places to put their kids and know that they're safe. Our challenges listed under the physical here. Right now, we're in the midst of our annual or twice a year walking challenge, which builds some camaraderie. It has a social component to it as well as the fitness component. So people form teams within various areas or across departments and are a bit competitive. It has a celebratory aspect to it and also gets people out and moving. And again, we've added this cultural piece, and this we would not take credit for, although we have one program that we're working on developing called Implicit Impact, along with some of our professors in the psychology department. But we are working to amplify. Our president came out very strongly with some calls to action last summer, and so we're working very strongly to make sure that those efforts that are happening through our training series and conversation series are getting amplified and promoted through our communications. So rising to the challenges. A lot of what we've been talking about today we're struggling with here, but initially what we did was began to communicate daily. We found that especially as people dispersed, there was a need for connection and a need to maintain trust in the institution and to stay connected with one another. So we focused very strongly on communicating daily with our faculty and staff. And again, doing the listening that we needed to on social media. We had a leave donation drive, knowing that many people were possibly going to run out of leave. This wasn't out of our office, this was out of our benefits office, but we helped again amplify that via social media and through our newsletter. And we had a goal of 200,000 hours and raised just over 260,000 hours of leave that were donated by people who, like we just said, probably had extra because they don't take enough, which is another problem, but we're generous in giving to people who might be running out of leave because they couldn't work for a certain period of time. We held town halls, like I mentioned, both about administrative workplace issues, as well as we have a really strong screen, test, and protect COVID-19 program here for screening and testing, as well as vaccination. The physician who runs that is incredibly available and has been a wonderful person to hold these. He'll just hold as many town halls as we want him to, and anybody could come and just ask him whatever questions that they had, and he was really open to that and has been a wonderful partner for us. We've established a family resource coordinator in our benefits office. So again, with the knowledge that people are facing family issues, needing to find childcare or discounts on childcare, family leave issues. So we have somebody devoted to kind of working with people in that capacity in our benefits team. We offered a week-long Resources to Restore Balance series with different faculty experts on mindfulness and well-being throughout campus, recorded those and made those available to our faculty and staff. Again, we're amplifying our anti-racism initiative. I mentioned the financial wellness series. And we've been promoting our employee assistance program, but I don't want to sugarcoat that because that is a challenge for us. I think like many areas, mental health providers in our area are overwhelmed right now, and we're struggling a bit. So as a result of that, we're working on a partnership with our Department of Psychiatry to provide more of a mental health triage to ensure people are getting connected as quickly as possible to any care that they might need. As I was listening again, we are struggling with the flexibility. I'm happy to talk about what we're doing here in terms of flexibility and remote arrangements. We are struggling with the childcare issues just like everyone else. And then burnout is a big issue that we're trying to find ways to address as well. So I see Liz coming back on. I hope I didn't take too long. Thank you.
Oh, that was so wonderful, Angie. Thank you so much. And we have our next presentation from UT Austin with Kate Lower and Patty Moore and Mix.
Sure, thanks Liz, and hi everybody. I'm Kate Lower. I'm the director of a program called Shift, or an initiative called Shift at UT Austin. And it is a broad, we like to say our bold call to action around culture change. And so that's a broad statement, and I've got like just a handful of minutes to try to squeeze it in. So please know this is just the beginning of a conversation, but we are a grant-funded opportunity that launched in September of 2019 to really shift the culture around substance use on college campuses. 6 months in, our culture shifted pretty significantly with COVID, and yet our work has remained relevant, has remained really interesting and challenging and busy. So ultimately what we're hoping to do, and we're hoping to be endowed when our grant expires, but ultimately, we want to reduce the negative consequences related with substance misuse and helping people understand that broad spectrum. So a negative consequence being anything from a missed class to not performing as well to substance use disorders and physical and sexual assault, that there's a continuum there. So we're wanting to see a reduction in that, but we're also wanting to see an increase in overall student well-being. And so a lot of our work is really challenging some of the norms and expectations, not only that students have, but also students and or faculty and staff and community members have as well. And really focusing on a more holistic picture. So Patty, you can go to the next slide if you don't mind. So we're doing this through 6 pilot initiatives. And again, I don't have time to go into all of them. You're welcome to check out our website or email me. I'm happy to continue this conversation. But Shift in and of itself is a really unique collaboration between the academic side and the School of Undergraduate Studies and the Division of Student Affairs. So I really report to both, are really integrated into both systems and try to break down those silos so that we're really addressing the student experience more holistically and from that multidimensional lens. However, our philosophy and our approach is really, when we talk about culture change, calling everybody who is a part of that culture into the conversation and into the work. So that includes staff and faculty, and like I said, even community members like hospitality folks. And each of these are represented differently throughout these pilots. Our first 2 pilots that are kind of highlighted in orange there give, I think, a good specific or concrete example of some of the ways we've done this, not only for student wellness in the classroom, but also how we've worked with faculty. And none of Shift culture change or culture shift does not happen by one person or even one department. It really is inherently collaborative. So that's why Patty Mix is also with me today, who will share a little bit about her experience as well. But we're wanting to talk about kind of in those first 2 pilots, really how we train faculty and mentors, just quickly to give you an example. And so Patty, you can go to the next slide again. And most of our work, while we're wanting to see that reduction, we're also wanting to see this increase of student overall well-being. And so we take a really strengths-based approach. Our training, you'll see the protective factors from the Search Institute, if you're familiar with those, woven into a lot of our different pilots in different ways, but very intentionally in faculty engagement and peer academic mentors. So we have mentors and coaches and things like that on the academic side. So it's taking what they already do, leveraging what already exists, and then how can we layer on some innovation? How can we help students and faculty feel a little bit more empowered to have conversations around wellness and well-being? And so we use the 40 assets. We also are trying to destigmatize these conversations. We often historically talk about substance use when it is problematic, which plays into this kind of historical approach of shaming or stigmatizing or silencing conversation, where it really leaves out a lot of our students and a lot of our staff and faculty as well, who make different decisions or have different needs. And so we're really trying to expand this dialogue and help give skills and support to both students and faculty, as well as staff members on how to have these conversations and where to work them in. And then I'd be happy to share examples if you're interested and want to connect, offline. But for the sake of time, Patty, I'll go ahead and let you kind of share some of your experiences as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. And thanks, y'all, for having us here today. And again, yeah, we have lots of information we can share later on. If you want to contact us on our last slide coming up next, we'll have our contact information as well. But really, as Kate said, and as many people have said before, we're really looking at this strengths-based approach, right? How do we use protective factors, things that already are embedded in our courses and our learning communities in the first year, and really amplify those. So things like connections with older adults, connections with peers, creative activities, engagement with your school, different things like that. Those are already pieces of how we built our programs. And so we help, I think, amplify those through SHIFT's mission. And again, enhancing these protective factors. What we know is that when faculty and our staff, who are mostly that we work with, usually learning specialists or college academic advisors and student support professionals, it has benefits for them as well. We talked today a little bit about, like, you know, the people who help the students also need help, right? Or the more we can be supported amongst each other, we're better able to help our students. And so I think that also helps with the faculty and staff when they're engaged and sort of invested in these programs. It helps them, I think, be more engaged in the lives of their students, but also I think, as maybe, you know, Megan or someone earlier said, they're actually taking those protective factors and using them in their own positions, in their own, you know, personal and professional lives. And we also know that this helps them, students and faculty and staff, make connections with each other. And we also know that's one of the biggest components to student persistence and retention and well-being, is having a connection on campus. We also want to make sure that we're building community resources for our faculty and staff, because we also know, being faculty and staff, that we also need care and community sort of support amongst ourselves too, when we are, you know, caring for and teaching and helping students learn. So we've had events in the fall. We've had one to highlight what our faculty are doing. We had the provost involved, really thanking them and giving faculty a chance to talk amongst each other about challenges they are facing. We do this a lot with our signature course faculty. We have things called Signature Course Faculty Fridays. We've had SHIFT come to some of our Signature Course events before and really talk about, how do you take, you don't have to be a mental health expert in order to, you know, embed these in your course. A lot of these things you already do, and perhaps you didn't even recognize that we call them protective factors. So I think that's helpful too, is giving faculty and staff this sense of community and support from SHIFT, that they really are part of a circle of community and circle of care. So again, if you'd like more information, because I know we are just at time, Kate and or I are happy to speak with you about our programs and our initiatives, which again are very unique, which I think transcend the academic and student affairs sides of things on our campus.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thanks to our presenters today, Megan Kennedy, Angie Brown, Patty Moore-Mix, and Kate Lower. Thank you again to Nance Roy and José Villalba for a great conversation. It's been wonderful to hear how campuses are working to change the culture around staff and faculty well-being. And I will again post this recording as soon as we get it captioned, and I'll send out a notification when that's done. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Reinventioncollaborative.org is our website, and it has contact information and will include resources from today's presentations and share the slides and everything as well. Thanks, everyone.